guys, Sandy Ingram here. Welcome. In today's video, let's compare the VND to the IQD. Now, both countries was at war with America. However, after the war, the two countries took two different paths. Let's take a look at how those paths chosen affects the currency, the IQD and the VND. Because Vietnam is governed by a communist system that closely controls its currency, the Vietnamese dong, VND, receives less attention from currency investors than many other emerging market currencies. That said, Vietnam's economy has grown rapidly, foreign investments remain strong, and the VND is often viewed as a relatively stable currency compared to some other developing nations. Now, the lack of discussion is usually more about government control and limited currency speculation opportunities than other economic weaknesses. Remember those two words, government control. But let's compare to better understand your VND investment. Like Iraq, Vietnam also experienced war with the United States. Their country was torn apart and sanctions were part of their everyday life. The North wanted to be communist and the South thought they wanted to be democracy. Or vice versa, not sure. Vietnam's attitude towards the war and America is vastly different than Iraq's. Vietnam now uses the American dollar to help facilitate its massive travel industry. In 2025, Vietnam welcomed about 21.2 million international visitors. Guys, that's 21.2 million international visitors and generated roughly 38 to 40 billion US dollars in tourism revenue, a record year for the country. Now here's why that tourism is so very, very important. Tourism in Vietnam contributes approximately 8 to 9% of Vietnam's GDP. Do I need to repeat that? 8 to 9%. Over $100 million comes from U.S. expats living in the country today. Now, here's what Vietnam's timeline looks like. In 1968 to 1975, Vietnam was at war, which damaged the economy and certainly the currency. In 1975 to 1986, the government tightly controlled the economy and the currency lost value. Okay, there's those words again. Government tightly controlled the economy. In 1986, Vietnam launched economic reforms, allowing more private business and foreign investments. Now, here's a major key difference in Vietnam and Iraq. Vietnam has never had a security issue. From 1990s to 2020s, the economy has grown rapidly in Vietnam, but the government chooses to keep the VND relatively weak to help exports and attract factories. Guys, you gotta understand that Vietnam is basically a communist country who acts like and grows money like a democracy. Today, Vietnam has a much stronger economy than it did decades ago. But the government still carefully manages the currency instead of allowing it to rise sharply. See, there are many investors around the globe who have no doubt that if the Vietnamese government took their fingers out of the pot and stopped controlling the currency, that the currency would rise automatically on its own. The VND, that's not happening according to the pattern, the economic pattern that Vietnam has set forth this far. Again, the Vietnam War was from the early 1960s until 1973, when the war ended. In 1975, after North Vietnam unified the country. That's right. The U.S. and democracy did not, I repeat, did not win the war. Please don't tell them that I said that I told you the truth. The Vietnamese government since 1975 has acted more like a massive corporation than a communist regime. The key difference is that Vietnam chooses an export-driven manufacturing economy. Let me say that again. Export-driven manufacturing economy, becoming a major producer of electronics, clothing, and consumer goods. In other words, the things that people just don't want to live without. Iraq's economy remains heavily dependent on oil revenues. See the difference? Now, today, roughly speaking, $1 buys about 25,000 to 26,000 VND. The large numbers does not mean Vietnam is poor or that the currency is failing. It simply means, here we go again, the government has allowed the currency to remain relatively weak compared to the US dollar. From this video, you may want to realize two crucial elements. One, Vietnam's government controls and continues to hold the VND down. In Iraq's case, it's the CBI, the Central Bank of Iraq, who openly holds the IQD down. And with good reason. Iraq is still implementing banking reform. So even if the CBI allowed the currency to float or do whatever it does, although it's tied to the US dollar, but if the CBI allowed the currency to increase in value, it would be difficult on an international level because the Iraqi banks don't yet talk to the banks in Hong Kong or London or New York. Not yet. Two, the second major difference you may want to understand as IQD and or VND currency investors is the people in Vietnam are welcoming to tourists and expats from all countries, including the United States.